They said her womb was cursed. In the dying light of autumn 1893, when the cornfields of Vermilion County stretched like golden graves beneath an indifferent sky, Eleanor Harper walked the dirt roads alone. Her shadow fell long and crooked behind her, and mothers would pull their children close when they saw it creeping across their doorsteps. 42 times she had carried life. 42 times she had buried it. The townspeople whispered that death followed her like a faithful dog. They crossed themselves when she passed the general store, clutched their rosaries tighter in church when she knelt in the back pew. But Eleanor Harper had stopped listening to their prayers long ago. She had her own conversation with God now, a bitter, one-sided affair that took place in the dead of night, beneath the withering oaks where her children slept. Each child had been born the same, silent, still, their faces pale as the winter moon, eyes closed as if in peaceful sleep. But it was the resemblance that haunted her most, how each tiny face seemed carved from the same block of marble, as though some cosmic sculptor had grown bored with variety and chosen instead to mock her with repetition. Dr. Wren called it genetics. A cruel trick of heredity, he said, adjusting his spectacles with hands that trembled more with each visit. But Eleanor had seen the way his jaw tightened when he examined each stillborn child. She had noticed how he would turn away quickly, as if the sight of those identical faces burned something deep in his physician's soul. The undertaker, Silas Gray, had grown rich from her sorrow. 42 small coffins he had crafted, each one smaller than a hope chest, each one lowered into earth that seemed to drink them up like a thirsty beast. He had stopped meeting her eyes after the 20th burial. By the 30th, he barely spoke at all. But it was after the 42nd child that everything changed. Eleanor had labored through a September night when the wind howled like banshees through the eaves of her small farmhouse. The child came quickly, too quickly, sliding into the world with the same terrible silence that had marked all the others. Wren had examined the infant with his usual clinical detachment, but when he looked up at Eleanor, something had shifted in his pale blue eyes. "Mrs. Harper," he had said, his voice barely above a whisper, "this child, its features." Eleanor had pulled herself up on trembling elbows, her hair damp with sweat, her body hollowed out by another failed hope. "What about its features, doctor?" Wren had glanced toward Silas Gray, who stood by the window with his measuring tape and his sorrowful expression. The two men had shared a look that Eleanor couldn't decipher, a look heavy with knowledge she wasn't meant to possess. "Nothing," Wren had said finally, wrapping the small form in white linen. "Simply genetics." But Eleanor had seen him studying the child's face with an intensity that suggested recognition rather than medical curiosity. She had watched him trace the tiny features with one finger, as if trying to place where he had seen them before. Later, as Silas Gray prepared to carry away her 42nd loss, he paused at her bedside. His weathered face, usually so carefully composed in the presence of grief, had cracked just slightly. "Mrs. Harper," he had said, "I've been burying children in this county for 30 years. I've seen twins. I've seen family resemblances that would make you swear the Lord was working from the same template." He had stopped, swallowed hard. "But these children of yours, they don't just look alike." Eleanor's heart had begun to pound. "What do you mean?" "They look like someone else entirely. Someone who ain't you, and sure as hell ain't your late husband. God rest his soul." The words had hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Eleanor had wanted to ask more, to demand answers, but Gray had already turned away, cradling her child like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. Now, 3 weeks later, Eleanor walked the same dirt road she had traveled 42 times before, heading toward the cemetery where her impossible children lay. The October air bit at her cheeks, and somewhere in the distance she could hear the sound of axes biting into wood as the men prepared for winter. But Eleanor Harper was preparing for something else entirely. She had begun to dream of faces, not the faces of her stillborn children, but older faces, faces marked by fire and fury. In her dreams, she heard voices calling her name, not with love or longing, but with something that sounded almost like recognition. The townspeople said her womb was cursed. They whispered that she was marked by God, punished for some sin she couldn't remember committing. But as Eleanor approached the 42nd grave beneath the withering oaks, she began to wonder if the curse wasn't hers at all. What if she was simply the vessel? What if something else, something hungry and patient and impossibly old, had chosen her body as a doorway between worlds? The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it filled her with a strange, dark comfort. For the first time in 10 years of loss, Eleanor Harper began to suspect that her children's deaths were not random cruelties of fate. They were appointments, scheduled visits from souls who had business left unfinished. And as she knelt beside the freshest grave, pressing her palm against the disturbed earth, Eleanor Harper whispered a question into the gathering darkness. "Who are you, and what do you want with me?" The wind carried no answer, but somewhere beneath her hand, something shifted in the soil, as if 42 small bodies had heard her voice and stirred in recognition. Do you ever wonder what it would feel like to carry death instead of life? To become a mother not to the living, but to something that refuses to stay buried? Dr. Jonathan Wren had not slept properly in 3 weeks. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those faces, 42 identical masks of death, each one etched into his memory with the precision of a gravestone inscription. His medical bag sat unopened beside his desk, its leather worn smooth by decades of house calls, but Jonathan could not bring himself to make his rounds. Not when every patient's face might transform into that same haunting visage that had plagued Eleanor Harper's womb. The ledger lay before him now, its pages filled with his careful physician's script. What had begun as clinical observations had devolved into something approaching madness. Entry after entry chronicled the impossible measurements, sketches, detailed notes about each stillborn child's features. By the 20th entry, his handwriting had grown erratic. By the 30th, his notes read more like the ravings of a man possessed. Child 31, born 2:47 a.m., weight 6 pounds 2 ounces. Same facial structure as all previous subjects. High cheekbones, narrow nose, eyes set wide apart. Small scar-like mark above left eyebrow. Impossible. Child never lived to acquire scarring. Note, this mark appears on all specimens. Child 34. The resemblance is no longer a coincidence. These are not variations on genetic inheritance. These are copies, perfect, identical copies of someone else's child. Child 39. I know this face. God help me. I know this face from somewhere. Dr. Wren's hands trembled as he turned to the final entry, written just 3 weeks ago in handwriting so shaky, it was barely legible. Child 42. The face belongs to Thomas Whitmore, age 7, who died in the sanctuary fire of 1851. I found the newspaper clipping in my father's papers. Thomas was one of 42 children who perished when the Eternal Light Sect's compound burned. The resemblance is exact. Eleanor Harper is not birthing her own children. She is birthing their children. The same 42, over and over, trying to return. The newspaper clipping was paper-clipped to the page, its edges yellow with age. The headline read, "Tragic fire claims 42 children. Sect leader promises vengeance from beyond." Jonathan had memorized every word of the article by now. The Eternal Light Sect had been a religious community that had settled on land later claimed by the Harper family. When Eleanor's great-grandfather had produced legal documents proving ownership, the sect had been forced to relocate. During their final night in the compound, a fire had swept through the wooden buildings with supernatural speed. 42 children had been trapped in the prayer hall, their bodies burned beyond recognition. But the article contained one detail that had made Jonathan's blood run cold. Sect leader Ezekiel Thorne declared with his dying breath that the Harper bloodline would never know the joy of living children until the debt was paid in full. A curse. An actual impossible curse that had somehow reached across 4 decades to claim Eleanor as its instrument. The sound of footsteps on his front porch made Jonathan slam the ledger shut. Through the window he could see Eleanor Harper's silhouette against the setting sun, her hand raised to knock. Her face was gaunt, her eyes hollowed by grief and sleepless nights, but there was something else there now, a determination that made Jonathan's stomach clench with dread. He considered not answering, considered letting her knock until she gave up and returned to her empty farmhouse. But Eleanor Harper was not a woman who gave up easily. She had buried 42 children and still walked upright. She would stand on his porch all night if necessary. Jonathan opened the door. "Dr. Wren," Eleanor said, her voice steady, despite the exhaustion that marked her features. "I need to see my children's medical records." "Mrs. Harper, I don't think that would be wise. Your grief is still fresh, and dwelling on medical details will only—" "My grief is not fresh," Eleanor interrupted, stepping past him into the house without invitation. "My grief is 10 years old and 42 bodies deep. What's fresh is my suspicion that you've been lying to me." Jonathan felt his pulse quicken. Eleanor moved through his parlor like a woman who knew exactly what she was looking for, her eyes scanning his bookshelves, his desk, the locked cabinet where he kept his private papers. "I've never lied to you, Mrs. Harper. I've simply tried to spare you unnecessary pain." Eleanor turned to face him, and Jonathan was struck by how much she had changed since her first pregnancy. The soft, hopeful young woman who had lost her husband in the quarry accident had been replaced by something harder, more dangerous. Something that would not be placated by gentle lies and medical euphemisms. "Sparing me pain." Eleanor laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Doctor, I have carried 42 dead children in my body. I have felt each one grow and move, and then fall silent. I have pushed them into this world knowing they would never draw breath. Do you honestly believe there is any pain left for you to spare me from?" Jonathan said nothing. What could he say? That he had hidden the truth to protect the town, that he had falsified records to prevent panic, that he had watched her suffer in silence because the alternative was admitting that something impossible was happening in Vermilion County. Eleanor stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap she used and see the fine lines that grief had carved around her eyes. "I know about the scars," she said quietly. Jonathan's blood turned to ice. "What scars?" "The small mark above the left eyebrow. Every single child had it. Identical placement, identical size. You noted it in your records, didn't you? You documented every impossible detail." Jonathan's mouth went dry. How could she know about his private notes? He had been so careful, so discreet. "I can see it in your face, Doctor. You know something you're not telling me. You've known all along." Eleanor's voice dropped to a whisper. "Who are my children?" The question hung between them like a blade. Jonathan felt 40 years of medical training war with the impossible evidence he had documented. Everything he had learned about anatomy, about genetics, about the rational order of the natural world, screamed that Eleanor Harper's situation was a coincidence. A tragic, inexplicable coincidence. But the newspaper clipping in his ledger told a different story. A story about curses and vengeance and children who had died screaming in flames 42 years ago. "Mrs. Harper," he said finally, "some knowledge is too dangerous to possess." Eleanor smiled, but it was the smile of a woman who had already decided to damn herself for the truth. "Doctor," she said, moving toward his locked cabinet, "I've been carrying dangerous knowledge in my womb for 10 years. Whatever you're hiding from me can't be worse than what I've already lived through." Jonathan watched helplessly as she examined the cabinet lock, her fingers tracing the brass mechanism with surprising familiarity. Where had a farm wife learned to pick locks? "Don't," he whispered. "Please. You don't understand what you're asking for." Eleanor paused, her hand on the lock, and looked back at him with eyes that seemed far older than her 38 years. "Then explain it to me," she said. "Tell me why my children all have the same face. Tell me why you've been documenting details you claim don't matter. Tell me why you're more afraid of the truth than I am." Jonathan stared at her for a long moment, seeing not the broken woman who had sought his help for 10 years, but something else, something that had been forged in the fire of impossible loss and shaped by mysteries too dark for daylight. He walked to his desk, unlocked the drawer, and withdrew the ledger. "Very well," he said, his voice barely audible. "But God forgive us both for what comes next. What would you do if you discovered that everything you thought you knew about life and death was wrong, that the very ground beneath your feet was nothing more than a thin veil, hiding truths too terrible for the living to bear?" The soil above Eleanor's children never settled properly. Silas Gray had noticed it after the 5th burial, though he had chosen to keep the observation to himself. Other graves in the Vermilion County Cemetery rested peacefully beneath their blankets of earth and grass, but Eleanor Harper's plot seemed to breathe. The ground would rise and fall in subtle movements, as if something underneath was stirring in restless sleep. By the 20th burial, Silas had begun to dread his nighttime walks through the cemetery. The groundskeeper's cottage sat just beyond the wrought iron gates, close enough that he could hear when the dead grew restless. And Eleanor's children were always restless. Now, standing beside the 42nd grave in the pre-dawn darkness, Silas Gray admitted to himself what he had been denying for years. Something was very wrong in the earth beneath his feet. The grave had been dug 3 weeks ago. The tiny coffin lowered with the same careful ritual that had marked the previous 41 burials, but the soil had never properly settled. Instead, it rose in a small mound that seemed to pulse with its own rhythm, like a heart beating beneath the ground. Silas knelt beside the grave and pressed his ear to the earth. What he heard made his blood run cold. Whispers, soft, childlike voices speaking in unison, their words too muffled by dirt and wood to understand, but their intent unmistakable. They were calling for something. Someone. They were calling for their mother. "Mr. Gray." Silas jerked upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Eleanor Harper stood at the cemetery gate, her pale nightgown ghostly in the moonlight. She moved between the headstones like a sleepwalker, her bare feet silent on the frost-covered grass. "Mrs. Harper," Silas said, rising to his feet, "you shouldn't be here, not at this hour." Eleanor approached the grave with the steady gait of a woman who had walked this path too many times to count. Her eyes were fixed on the disturbed soil, and Silas could see in her expression the same unsettled recognition that had been growing in his own mind. "It moves," she said simply. "The earth moves." Silas nodded reluctantly. There was no point in denying what they could both see. "It's been moving since the first burial, Mrs. Harper. I hoped it would settle eventually." Eleanor knelt beside the 42nd grave, placing her palm flat against the raised earth. As soon as her skin made contact with the soil, the whispers grew louder. Silas could hear them now even without pressing his ear to the ground. A chorus of children's voices speaking in perfect unison. "Mother," they whispered. "Mother, we're waiting." Eleanor's face went white, but she didn't pull her hand away. Instead, she pressed harder against the earth, as if trying to reach through the soil to whatever lay beneath. "How long have you heard them?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Silas swallowed hard. "Since the beginning. But they're getting stronger, louder. Each burial makes them more present." Eleanor looked up at him, and in her eyes Silas saw a terrible understanding beginning to dawn. "They're not at rest," she said. "None of them. They're all still here, still waiting." "Waiting for what?" Eleanor rose to her feet, brushing grave dirt from her nightgown. When she spoke, her voice carried a certainty that chilled Silas more than the October wind. "Waiting to be born properly. waiting to live. She walked to the next grave, then the next, pressing her hand to each small mound of earth. At every touch, the whispers grew stronger, more insistent. 42 voices calling for their mother, 42 souls trapped between worlds. "Mrs. Harper," Silas said urgently, "you need to stop. This isn't natural. This isn't right." But Eleanor wasn't listening. She had begun to dig. Her hands moved with desperate efficiency, clawing at the soil of the most recent grave. Dirt flew behind her as she dug deeper, her nightgown staining brown with earth, and her hair falling in wild tangles around her face. "Mrs. Harper, please. I have to see," Eleanor gasped, her hands bloody from scraping against stones. "I have to know what's down there." Silas grabbed her shoulders, trying to pull her away from the grave, but Eleanor fought him with surprising strength. She was like a woman possessed, driven by a need that transcended reason or sanity. "Let me go," she screamed. "Let me see my child." Her fingers finally found wood, the smooth surface of the tiny coffin buried 3 feet below. But instead of the solid thunk of nails and timber, her knuckles met empty air. The coffin lid had somehow come open. Eleanor's scream died in her throat. She stared down into the dark hole she had dug, her hands frozen above the open coffin. Inside, where her 42nd child should have been lying in peaceful repose, there was nothing but empty white satin lining. The coffin was empty. "That's impossible," Silas whispered, leaning over the grave to see for himself. "I sealed that coffin myself. I lowered it into the ground with my own hands." Eleanor's face had gone beyond pale into something approaching gray. She looked up at Silas with eyes that seemed to see too much, understand too much. "Check the others," she said, her voice hollow as a bell. "Mrs. Harper, I can't." "Check them." Eleanor's shriek echoed across the cemetery, sending night birds spiraling up from the trees. "Check every grave, I have to know." Against every instinct, against 40 years of respecting the dead, Silas Gray began to dig. The second grave yielded the same impossible result, an empty coffin, its lid somehow opened from within. The third grave was the same. By the time they had exhumed the 5th small coffin, both Eleanor and Silas were covered in grave dirt and trembling with exhaustion, but they couldn't stop. Every grave was empty. 42 tiny coffins, 42 careful burials, and not a single body remained where it had been laid to rest. Eleanor sat back on her heels beside the excavated graves, her chest heaving with exertion and something approaching hysteria. Around them, the cemetery looked like a battlefield, small craters dotting the ground where tiny coffins sat open and abandoned. "Where are they?" she whispered. "Where are my children?" Silas had no answer. In 40 years of burying the dead, he had never seen anything like this. Bodies didn't simply vanish from sealed coffins. Infant corpses didn't climb out of graves and walk away into the night. But as he stared at the empty coffins surrounding them, Silas Gray began to understand that everything he thought he knew about death was wrong. The dead didn't always stay buried. Sometimes they had places to go. Eleanor rose to her feet, grave dirt falling from her nightgown like dark snow. When she looked at Silas, her eyes held a knowledge that was both terrible and certain. "They were never dead," she said quietly. "They were waiting, gathering, growing stronger with each birth." "Mrs. Harper, that's not possible." 42 children, Mr. Gray, all with the same face, all born without breath, but somehow still present. Eleanor gestured to the empty graves surrounding them. "They've been using my body as a doorway." Each birth brought one of them closer to returning. The whispers had stopped. The cemetery lay in perfect, unnatural silence, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. But in that silence, Silas could feel something watching them, something that had been patient for far too long. Eleanor walked toward the cemetery gate, leaving him alone among the empty graves. At the iron archway she paused and looked back. 42 graves, Mr. Gray. 42 empty coffins. But I've only given birth 42 times. Her voice carried across the cemetery like a funeral bell. What happens when I give them the 43rd? And as Eleanor Harper disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, Silas Gray remained alone in the cemetery, surrounded by evidence of the impossible, wondering what kind of birth could empty graves and summon whispers from the earth itself. Have you ever wondered what happens to souls that refuse to accept death? What if dying isn't an ending, but simply a different kind of waiting? The year 1893 had brought wonders to Chicago, electric lights blazing through the World's Fair exotic pavilions, displaying marvels from distant lands, the great Ferris wheel turning like a mechanical prayer against the sky. But in Vermilion County, time seemed to move differently. Here the clocks ran slower, the shadows fell darker, and the people spoke in whispers that carried the weight of old secrets. Eleanor Harper had become the town's unspoken shame. She noticed it first in the way conversations died when she entered the general store. Mrs. Patterson, who had sold her flour and sugar for 10 years, now refused to meet her eyes. The woman would slide Eleanor's purchases across the counter without a word, her fingers trembling as she counted out change, as if touching Eleanor's money might somehow contaminate her with the same curse that had marked the Harper bloodline. The children were worse. They had once pointed at her from doorways, their young faces bright with the cruel curiosity that children reserve for tragedy. But now they ran when they saw her coming, scattering like startled birds, their mothers pulling them close and whispering fierce prayers of protection. Eleanor walked the main street of Vermilion Falls on a gray October morning, her shopping basket empty, her purpose more about defiance than necessity. She needed to understand what had changed. 3 weeks ago she had been an object of pity, now she was something else entirely, something feared. The answer came from an unexpected source. "They're saying you dug up your babies." Eleanor turned to find Tommy Brennan, the blacksmith's boy, standing beside the post office, with his hands shoved deep in his pockets. He was perhaps 14, old enough to understand adult whispers, but young enough to speak truths that adults wouldn't dare voice. "Who's saying that, Tommy?" The boy glanced around nervously, as if speaking to Eleanor Harper in public was itself a dangerous act. "My mom, Mrs. Patterson. Pretty much everyone. They say Silas Gray told Pastor Morrison that the cemetery's been disturbed." Eleanor felt something cold settle in her stomach. Silas had promised to keep their midnight excavation secret, but apparently the weight of 42 empty graves had been too much for even an undertaker's discretion. "And what else are they saying?" Tommy shifted uncomfortably, his young face flushed with embarrassment. "They're saying you're not right, Mrs. Harper, that you've gone mad with grief and started digging up coffins to hold your babies again." Eleanor closed her eyes. The truth was so much worse than their gossip, but she couldn't blame them for creating explanations that fit within the boundaries of human understanding. Mad grief was something they could comprehend. Empty graves and whispers from the earth were not. "Tommy," she said quietly, "do you believe that's what I did?" The boy studied her face with the serious intensity that children bring to important questions. After a long moment, he shook his head. "No, ma'am. My man thinks grief makes people do crazy things, but you don't look crazy to me. You look—" He paused, searching for the right word. "You look like someone who's seen something the rest of us ain't ready to see." Out of the mouths of babes, Eleanor smiled sadly and reached into her pocket, withdrawing a penny to press into Tommy's palm. "You're a wise boy, Tommy Brennan. Wiser than most of the adults in this town." As she walked away, Eleanor heard Tommy call after her, "Mrs. Harper, whatever you saw, I hope it leaves you be." But Eleanor knew it wouldn't leave her be. It had been waiting too long, planning too carefully, to simply abandon its chosen vessel now. The proof of the town's true knowledge came that evening. Eleanor had returned to her farmhouse to find a symbol carved deep into her front gate, two interlocking circles pierced by a jagged line. The mark was fresh, the wood still bleeding sap, and it had been carved with deliberate precision. This was not the work of vandals or children playing pranks. This was a message. Eleanor traced the symbol with her finger, and as she did, fragments of memory began to surface. She had seen this mark before, years ago, in the burned ruins of an old foundation she had discovered while walking her property line. At the time, she had dismissed it as nothing more than weathered stone and coincidental scratches. Now she understood it was a warning, or perhaps a beacon. She found the same symbol carved into the door of the general store the next morning, burned into the side of the church, scratched into the bark of the oak tree that shaded the town square. Someone, or perhaps everyone, was marking territory, creating boundaries, preparing defenses against something they feared was coming. Eleanor began to pay closer attention to the whispered conversations that died when she approached. She lingered outside windows, pressed her ear to doors, gathered fragments of fearful talk like pieces of a puzzle she was finally ready to assemble. 42 years since the burning should have salted the ground when we had the chance. Her great-grandfather swore it was legal, but some debts can't be paid with paper. The children are getting stronger. My Sarah heard them singing last night. The children were hearing them too. Of course they were. Children had always been more sensitive to things that adults had trained themselves not to see. Eleanor wondered how many young voices in Vermilion Falls were now hearing the same whispers that had been calling her name from beneath the cemetery soil. She found Pastor Morrison preparing for evening service, his usually steady hands shaking as he arranged his sermon notes. When he saw Eleanor in the doorway of his church, his face went pale as communion wine. "Mrs. Harper," he said, his voice barely steady. "I wasn't, that is, I didn't expect." "Pastor," Eleanor said, stepping into the sanctuary she had once found comforting, "I need you to tell me about the Eternal Light sect." The sermon notes scattered to the floor like falling leaves. Pastor Morrison stared at her as if she had spoken in tongues, his mouth opening and closing without sound. "I don't know what you mean," he finally managed. Eleanor walked slowly down the aisle, her footsteps echoing in the empty church. The stained glass windows cast colored shadows across the wooden pews, but today the light seemed dimmed, as if the very air was thick with secrets. "I think you do know," she said. "I think this whole town knows. The symbols appearing everywhere, the way people look at me now, not with pity anymore, but with terror. You're not afraid of what I might do, Pastor. You're afraid of what I might become." Pastor Morrison sank into his chair behind the pulpit, suddenly looking far older than his 50 years. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of guilt that had been growing heavier for decades. "The Eternal Light sect built their sanctuary on land that legally belonged to your family," he said quietly. "Your great-grandfather had the papers to prove it. A land grant from the state, properly filed and recorded. But the sect had been living there for 5 years. They had built their homes, planted their crops, buried their dead in that soil." Eleanor felt pieces clicking into place. What happened when he tried to claim the land? He gave them 6 months to relocate, legal notice, proper procedures, everything done according to law. Pastor Morrison's hands were shaking more violently now. But Ezekiel Thorne, their leader, refused to go. He claimed the land had been consecrated by their prayers, that God himself had granted them dominion over it. So my great-grandfather had them removed by force. Pastor Morrison nodded miserably. Sheriff's deputies, federal marshals, a whole army of lawmen to evict 43 adults and 42 children from the only home they'd known. Thorne declared it an act of war against God's chosen people. Eleanor felt her blood turn cold. 42 children. Yes, and on their last night in the sanctuary, before they were to be forcibly relocated, Pastor Morrison's voice broke. The fire started in the prayer hall, 42 children trapped inside, the adults locked out. By the time they broke down the doors, it was too late. An accident? Pastor Morrison's silence was answer enough. Eleanor stared at the cross hanging above the altar, its wooden surface worn smooth by decades of desperate prayers. How many of those prayers had been pleas for forgiveness? How many had been requests for protection from a vengeance that had been building strength for 42 years? Ezekiel Thorne died in the fire, Pastor Morrison continued, but not before he spoke a curse that chilled the blood of every man who heard it. He swore that the Harper bloodline would know no joy from children until every lost soul had found its way home. Eleanor laughed, but the sound held no humor. And you've all been waiting for that curse to come true. Your mother lost 3 babies before you were born, stillbirths, all of them, all with the same features. We hoped the curse had died with her. Pastor Morrison looked up at Eleanor with eyes full of fear and pity. But then you married young Harper and the pregnancies began, and we realized the curse hadn't ended. It had only been waiting for the right vessel. The right vessel. Eleanor had become a doorway between worlds, a passage through which 42 murdered children could attempt their return to life. And everyone in Vermilion Falls had known. They had watched her suffer for 10 years, burying baby after baby, while they prayed in secret that the curse would somehow exhaust itself before demanding payment from the town that had enabled the original massacre. Eleanor walked toward the church door, her footsteps echoing in the silence. At the threshold she paused and looked back at Pastor Morrison, who sat hunched behind his pulpit like a man awaiting judgment. "Pastor," she said quietly, "what happens when a curse finally gets what it wants?" Pastor Morrison had no answer, but as Eleanor Harper stepped out into the gathering dusk, she could hear them again, the whispers rising from the earth, the voices of 42 children calling her name with increasing urgency. They were no longer content to wait in empty graves. They were ready to come home. What would you do if you discovered that your entire life had been orchestrated by the sins of your ancestors? That your body, your womb, your very existence was nothing more than payment on a debt you never knew was owed? Agnes Carraway lived where the civilized world ended and something wilder began. Her cabin crouched at the edge of Whitmore Woods, like a thing that had grown rather than been built, its weathered boards gray as old bones, its windows dark as secrets. The townspeople of Vermilion Falls spoke her name in whispers when they spoke it at all. Agnes Carraway, who had brought more children into the world than any doctor, who knew herbs that could ease pain or end pregnancies, who saw things that others were wise enough to ignore. Eleanor Harper walked the narrow path through the woods as the October sun died behind the trees, casting long shadows that seemed to reach for her with desperate fingers. She had avoided this journey for 10 years, telling herself that doctors and science would provide the answers she sought. But science had failed her, and doctors had lied to her, and now only one person remained who might know the truth about her impossible pregnancies. The midwife who had delivered 38 of her 42 stillborn children. Agnes Carraway was waiting on her porch, as if she had known Eleanor was coming. The old woman rocked slowly in a chair that groaned with each movement, her milky eyes fixed on some point beyond the trees that ordinary sight could not reach. She was ancient. No one in town could remember a time when Agnes had narrowed, had not been old, but her hands remained steady and her voice sharp as winter wind. "Eleanor Harper," Agnes said without turning her head, "took you long enough to find your way to my door." Eleanor climbed the sagging porch steps, her heart hammering against her ribs. Up close, Agnes looked like something carved from driftwood and dressed in shadows. Her white hair hung in thin braids decorated with small bones and dried herbs, and her dress was the deep brown of rich earth. But it was her eyes that made Eleanor's breath catch, clouded with cataracts, but somehow seeing far too much. "Miss Carraway," Eleanor said, her voice barely steady, "I need to ask you about my children." Agnes laughed, but the sound held no warmth. "Your children," Child, those babies were never yours. You were just the vessel they used to try to return. The blunt statement hit Eleanor like a physical blow. She sank into the wooden chair beside Agnes's rocker, her hands gripping the armrests as if the world had suddenly tilted beneath her feet. What do you mean they weren't mine? Agnes continued rocking, her chair keeping a steady rhythm like a funeral drum. I mean, I delivered 38 identical children from your womb, and not one of them belonged to your bloodline. They had the same face, the same marks, the same impossible resemblance to children who died before you were born. Eleanor felt tears burning behind her eyes, but she forced them back. She had not come here to weep. She had come for the truth, no matter how terrible it might be. Then whose children were they? Agnes stopped rocking. Her clouded eyes turned toward Eleanor, and for a moment they seemed to clear, as if some inner sight was focusing on things beyond the physical world. Your mother asked me the same question, Agnes said quietly. Sarah Harper, God rest her tortured soul. She came to me after her third stillbirth, desperate for answers I wasn't ready to give. Eleanor's heart stuttered. My mother lost babies too. 3 of them. All born silent, all with the same face that would later mark your own impossible children. Sarah thought she was being punished for some secret sin, but I knew better. I had seen that face before, in older deliveries, stranger births. Agnes rose from her chair with surprising grace and shuffled into the cabin. Eleanor followed, stepping into a single room that seemed larger than its exterior walls should have allowed. Herbs hung in bundles from the rafters, their scent thick and medicinal. Shelves lined the walls, filled with jars of things Eleanor preferred not to identify, and everywhere scattered across tables and windowsills were small sketches of children's faces, dozens of identical portraits drawn in charcoal and faded ink. Your grandmother lost 5 babies. Agnes continued, lighting a lamp that cast dancing shadows across the drawn faces. Your great-grandmother lost 7. Every generation of Harper women for 42 years has been visited by the same impossible births. Eleanor stared at the sketches, her hands shaking. Every face was the same. The high cheekbones, the wide-set eyes, the small scar above the left eyebrow that no infant should have possessed. Decades of identical stillbirths, documented by a midwife who had been collecting evidence of the impossible. Who are they? Eleanor whispered. Agnes moved to an old trunk in the corner of the room, her movements deliberate as ritual. From within its depths, she withdrew a bundle wrapped in black cloth, something precious and terrible that had been waiting for this moment to be revealed. The Eternal Light sect came to me before the fire, Agnes said, unwrapping the bundle with reverent care. Not for birthing. They had their own ways, their own ceremonies. They came because Ezekiel Thorne had received a vision, and visions in those days were not things to be ignored. Inside the black cloth was a daguerreotype, one of the early photographs that required subjects to sit perfectly still for long exposures. But this image showed 42 children arranged in careful rows, their faces solemn with the gravity that children bring to important occasions. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. They were all identical. Every single child in the photograph wore the same face that had marked her stillborn babies. Impossible, Eleanor breathed. The Eternal Light believed in reincarnation, Agnes explained, settling back into a chair that seemed to be made of twisted roots. They believed that souls returned in cycles, learning and growing until they achieved perfect spiritual understanding. But they also believed that souls could be trapped between worlds if their deaths were violent enough, traumatic enough. Eleanor couldn't tear her eyes away from the photograph. 42 children, all wearing the face that had haunted her womb for 10 years. These children, they're the ones who died in the fire. Agnes nodded gravely. Ezekiel Thorne's vision showed him what would happen, the legal battles, the forced eviction, the final desperate night when they would be trapped in their prayer hall while flames devoured everything they held sacred. He saw his children dying, And he saw something worse. Their souls being prevented from moving on to their next incarnation because of the violent nature of their deaths. Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. So he cursed my family. He bound their souls to the Harper bloodline. Agnes corrected. Every Harper woman would carry them, birth them, give them another chance at the life that was stolen from them. But the curse was flawed, born from desperation and rage rather than careful spiritual work. The children could return, but they couldn't stay. They were caught between death and life, unable to move forward, unable to go back. Eleanor sank into a chair, the photograph clutched in her trembling hands. 42 faces stared back at her with the patient innocence of children who had never been allowed to grow up. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why did you let me suffer for 10 years without knowing the truth?" Agnes leaned forward, her clouded eyes suddenly intense. "Because knowledge of the curse wouldn't have changed anything. You still would have carried them, still would have birthed them, still would have buried them. But now something has shifted." Eleanor looked up. "What do you mean?" Agnes gestured toward the window, where the last light of day was fading into purple dusk. "The 42nd child should have been the end. Ezekiel Thorne bound 42 souls to your bloodline. No more, no less. But I can feel something building, child. Something that wasn't part of the original curse." Eleanor's heart began to race. The 43rd. "Yes." Agnes's voice dropped to a whisper. "The 43rd child will be different. It won't be one of Thorne's lost souls trying to return. It will be something else entirely, something that has been growing stronger with each failed birth, feeding on the spiritual energy of the curse itself." Eleanor rose to her feet, the photograph falling from her nerveless fingers. "What kind of something?" Agnes Caraway smiled, but it was the smile of a woman who had seen too much of both life and death to find comfort in either. "The kind of something that will finally give those 42 souls what they've been waiting for," she said. "Not life, child. Release. The 43rd will be the key that unlocks their prison and sets them free to continue their journey." Eleanor felt ice forming in her veins. "And what happens to me?" Agnes's smile faded. "You've served your purpose, Eleanor Harper. You've been the vessel, the doorway, the instrument of their return. But once they're free," she shrugged, as if discussing something as mundane as the weather. "Well, doors can be closed, vessels can be emptied, instruments can be set aside." Eleanor backed toward the cabin door, her mind reeling with the implications of Agnes's words. She had been nothing more than a tool, shaped by forces beyond her understanding to serve a purpose that would ultimately destroy her. "How long do I have?" she asked. Agnes tilted her head, listening to sounds that Eleanor couldn't hear. "The 43rd is already growing within you, child. I can sense its presence, its hunger. You have perhaps a month before it demands to be born." Eleanor stumbled out of the cabin and into the gathering darkness, Agnes's words echoing in her mind like funeral bells. Behind her she could hear the old midwife calling out one final piece of advice. "Don't fight it, Eleanor Harper. Fighting will only make the birthing harder. Let the 43rd come when it's ready, and pray that whatever emerges has mercy on us all." But as Eleanor Harper ran through the woods toward her empty farmhouse, she wondered if there was any mercy left in a world where children could be murdered for land disputes and curses could stretch across 4 decades to claim the innocents. Have you ever considered that some debts can only be paid with blood? That the sins of previous generations can reach across time itself to demand justice from those who never knew they owed it? Eleanor Harper no longer slept in her bed. Sleep had become a dangerous country, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead grew thin as morning mist. She had taken to dozing fitfully in the kitchen chair, her back against the wall, her eyes trained on the bedroom door that had become a portal for impossible visitors. They came to her in dreams that felt more real than waking 42 children standing at her bedside, their faces identical masks of pale perfection. They never spoke, but their presence filled her mind with whispers that carried the weight of decades. Mother, they called her, though she had never given life to any of them. Mother, we're so tired of waiting. But it was what she found when she woke that truly terrified her. Soot, black as charcoal, fine as dust, scattered across her pillow where her head had rested. It appeared every morning now, no matter where she slept, as if something made of ash and smoke had lain beside her in the darkness, breathing memories of fire into her dreams. Eleanor gathered the strange residue in her palm, studying its texture in the pale October sunlight that filtered through her kitchen window. It felt warm against her skin, and when she closed her eyes, she could almost hear echoes of children's laughter carried on wind that smelled of burning wood. The county courthouse sat like a brick monument to bureaucracy in the center of Vermilion Falls, its records room filled with the accumulated paperwork of 40 years of land disputes, births, deaths, and legal proceedings. Eleanor had avoided this place for weeks, dreading what she might discover in its dusty files, but Agnes Carraway's revelations had made further investigation inevitable. She needed to know exactly what her great-grandfather had done. She needed to understand the precise nature of the debt that her womb had been paying for 4 decades. The clerk, a nervous man named Phillips who stammered when he spoke and jumped at shadows, led her to a basement room where the oldest records were stored. His hands shook as he lit the gas lamps, casting dancing shadows across rows of filing cabinets and leather-bound ledgers. "The 1851 records are in the far section," Phillips said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But Mrs. Harper, I have to warn you, some of those files are disturbing." The Eternal Light incident was not something the county likes to remember. Eleanor nodded grimly. "I understand, Mr. Phillips. Thank you." The man fled as if something were chasing him, leaving Eleanor alone among the records of the dead. She found the Eternal Light files easily enough, a thick folder bound with red ribbon, as if someone had wanted to mark it as particularly dangerous. Inside were witness statements, property deeds, and a collection of photographs that made her blood run cold. The fire had been thorough. The wooden prayer hall where 42 children had died was nothing but charred beams and ash when the photographs were taken. But scattered among the ruins were things that should not have survived the flames. 42 small shapes, blackened beyond recognition but unmistakably human. Eleanor studied the photographs with the detached fascination of someone examining evidence of her own damnation. The children had been arranged in careful rows even in death, as if whoever had found them had tried to preserve some dignity in the aftermath of horror. But it was their faces that made Eleanor's hands tremble. The intense heat of the fire had burned away individual features, leaving behind masks of charred flesh that looked remarkably similar. The high cheekbones, the wide-set eye sockets, the small depression above the left brow where living flesh had once been marked by some childhood accident, all rendered identical by the democracy of flame. Eleanor reached into her pocket and withdrew the daguerreotype that Agnes Carraway had given her. She placed it beside the post-fire photographs, comparing the living faces with their burned counterparts. The resemblance was exact. Fire had not destroyed their individual features. It had revealed their true nature, stripping away the illusion of separate identities to expose the single soul that had inhabited all 42 bodies. But that was impossible. 42 different children could not share the same soul, could not wear the same face beneath their skin, unless... Eleanor pulled out another document from the file, a witness statement given by Deputy Marshal William Crawford, who had been present during the forced eviction of the Eternal Light sect. His account was written in the careful official language of legal proceedings, but between the lines, Eleanor could read a deeper horror. The children of the sect appeared to be under some form of collective influence or shared consciousness. They moved in perfect unison, spoke in identical voices, and displayed an unnatural similarity of features that became more pronounced during times of distress. Sect leader Ezekiel Thorne claimed this was evidence of their spiritual advancement, stating that his followers had achieved a level of unity that transcended individual identity. Eleanor set down the document with shaking hands. The Eternal Light sect had not simply been a religious community, they had been something else entirely. Something that had used the bodies of 42 children as vessels for a single powerful consciousness. And that consciousness had been murdered, burned alive in a prayer hall while trying to escape through 42 different bodies at once. More documents painted a clearer picture of the massacre. Eleanor's great-grandfather, Josiah Harper, had indeed possessed legal ownership of the land. His property deed was legitimate, filed properly with the state, and backed by federal authority. But the Eternal Light sect had been living on the land for 5 years, long enough to establish their own claim through occupation and improvement. The dispute had escalated quickly. Josiah Harper had demanded immediate evacuation. Ezekiel Thorne had refused, claiming divine mandate for their presence. Federal marshals had been called in to enforce the law, and what should have been a simple eviction had turned into something approaching a siege. Eleanor found the final document in the file, Ezekiel Thorne's last statement, given as he lay dying from burns that covered 90% of his body. His words were recorded by a court stenographer who had been present to document the official proceedings. Josiah Harper has murdered the children of God for the sake of earthly ownership. But death is not the end, it is merely a doorway. These 42 souls will return to claim what was stolen from them. They will inhabit the wombs of Harper women until justice is satisfied. Each generation will pay the price in blood and sorrow, and the debt will compound like interest on borrowed time. The children will return, and return, and return, and return, until one is finally allowed to live. Only then will the curse be satisfied. Only then will the dead finally rest. Eleanor stared at the stenographer's careful script, seeing her own fate written in the testimony of a dying man. 42 attempts at return, 42 failures to achieve lasting life. But the curse had specified that one child must be allowed to live, the 43rd, the key that would unlock the prison holding 42 murdered souls. She was already carrying that key. Agnes Caraway had sensed its presence, and Eleanor could feel it too. A different kind of pregnancy, one that pulsed with purpose rather than hope. The 43rd child would be born alive, and when it drew its first breath, the curse would be complete. But what would happen to the world when 42 vengeful spirits were finally set free? Eleanor gathered the documents and photographs, stuffing them into her coat pockets with hands that refused to stop trembling. She needed to leave this place, needed to return to her farmhouse where she could think clearly about what she had learned. As she climbed the stairs from the records room, she heard Phillips calling after her. "Mrs. Harper, you forgot to sign the visitor log." But Eleanor Harper was already gone, fleeing into the October afternoon with the weight of terrible knowledge pressing down on her shoulders like a burial shroud. Behind her, in the basement of the county courthouse, gas lamps flickered as if disturbed by passing spirits, and shadows gathered in corners where no shadows should have been able to form. The dead were growing restless. They knew their time of return was finally at hand. What happens when you discover that your entire existence has been orchestrated by the dead? That every breath you've taken, every choice you've made, has been nothing more than steps in a dance choreographed by vengeful spirits who refuse to accept the finality of death. Dr. Jonathan Wren had not left his house in 5 days. The medical bag that had been his constant companion for 30 years sat abandoned by the front door, its leather cracked and dusty, its contents untouched since Eleanor Harper had confronted him with the truth about her impossible children. Patients had come knocking, seeking treatment for fevers and broken bones and the 1,000 small ailments that marked ordinary human suffering, but Jonathan could not bring himself to answer their calls. How could he tend to the living when he had spent 10 years documenting evidence of the dead? His ledger lay open on the kitchen table, its pages spread like accusations in the lamplight. 42 entries chronicling impossible births, 42 sketches of faces that should not have existed, 42 pieces of evidence that the natural order of the world was nothing more than a comforting lie told by those too frightened to acknowledge the truth. Jonathan poured another glass of whiskey, his fifth since sunset, and tried to make sense of what his life had become. He had trained at the finest medical college in Chicago, had studied anatomy and physiology with professors who believed that science could explain every mystery the human body might present. But science had no explanation for children who wore the faces of the long dead, no theory that could account for pregnancies that served as doorways between worlds. A knock at the front door made him jump, spilling whiskey across his careful notes. Through the window he could see Eleanor Harper's silhouette against the October evening, her hand raised to knock again with the persistence of someone who would not be ignored. Jonathan considered pretending he wasn't home. He had nothing left to offer Eleanor Harper except more terrible truths, and he suspected she had already learned more than any living person should know about the curse that had marked her bloodline. But Eleanor Harper was not a woman who accepted closed doors easily. "I know you're in there, Doctor," she called, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had moved beyond polite social conventions. "I can see the lamplight, and I can smell the whiskey. We need to talk." Jonathan rose unsteadily to his feet, the alcohol making his movements clumsy and uncertain. When he opened the door, Eleanor pushed past him without invitation, her eyes immediately finding the open ledger on his table. "Still documenting the impossible?" she asked, her tone holding no judgment, only a weary recognition of shared burden. Jonathan closed the door and turned to face her, seeing in her gaunt features the same exhaustion that had been consuming him for weeks. Eleanor Harper looked like a woman who had stopped sleeping, stopped eating, stopped pretending that normal life was possible when the dead refused to stay buried. "I've been trying to make sense of it," he said, his words slightly slurred by drink and despair. 30 years of medical practice, and nothing prepared me for what I've witnessed in your cases." Eleanor moved to the table and began studying his notes, her fingers tracing the sketches he had made of her stillborn children. Jonathan watched her face, seeing no surprise at the meticulous documentation of her tragedy, only a grim confirmation of what she already knew. "You've been hiding this from the town," she said. It was not a question. Jonathan nodded miserably. What was I supposed to do? Tell them that Eleanor Harper was giving birth to the ghosts of murdered children? Explain that medical science had no answer for repeated identical stillbirths that defied every law of genetics and heredity? Eleanor looked up from the ledger, her eyes holding a hardness that had not been there 10 years ago when she had first sought his help through her pregnancies. "You could have told me the truth. You could have saved me 10 years of thinking I was somehow defective, somehow cursed by my own failures as a woman." "The truth?" Jonathan laughed bitterly, reaching for the whiskey bottle. "Mrs. Harper, the truth would have driven you mad. Hell, the truth is driving me mad, and I'm only documenting it, I'm not living it." Eleanor grabbed the bottle from his hands before he could pour another glass. "I'm already living in madness, Doctor. I've been carrying dead children in my womb for a decade, birthing the same impossible face over and over again. What truth could be worse than that reality?" Jonathan stared at her, seeing in her determined stance the transformation that suffering had wrought. The soft, hopeful young woman who had lost her husband in a quarry accident had been replaced by something harder, more dangerous, something that would not be protected from difficult knowledge. "Very well," he said, moving to a cabinet where he kept his most private papers. "But remember, Mrs. Harper, you asked for this." He withdrew a folder, marked with the same red ribbon that had bound the county records, its contents representing years of secret investigation into the Harper family curse. Jonathan had not been content to simply document Eleanor's impossible pregnancies. He had researched, investigated, traced the curse back through generations of Harper women. "Your mother was not the first," he began, spreading photographs and medical records across the table. I found documentation of similar cases going back 42 years, Harper women who suffered repeated identical stillbirths, always with the same facial features, always with the same inexplicable medical anomalies. Eleanor studied the photographs, seeing faces she recognized from family gatherings, her grandmother, her great-grandmother, women who had carried the same burden in silence, who had died without ever understanding why their wombs had become graveyards for impossible children. But there's something else, Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. Something I discovered only recently, something that explains why I was chosen to be your physician. Eleanor looked up sharply. Chosen? Jonathan nodded, his hands shaking as he reached for a daguerreotype that looked identical to the one Agnes Carroway had shown her. But this photograph showed not the 42 children of the Eternal Light sect, but a group of adult men posed in formal dress outside the county courthouse. The men who carried out the eviction, Jonathan explained. The federal marshals, the local sheriff, the deputies who enforced Josiah Harper's claim to the land. His finger traced the figures in the photograph, stopping at a young man in uniform. Deputy Marshal Theodore Wren. My grandfather. Eleanor felt ice forming in her stomach. Your family was involved in the massacre. My grandfather was one of the men who locked those children in the prayer hall, Jonathan said, his voice breaking. He was following orders, enforcing legal property rights. But he gestured helplessly at the evidence surrounding them. Ezekiel Thorne's curse didn't target only the Harper bloodline. It bound everyone involved in the children's deaths to serve as instruments of their return. Eleanor sank into a chair, the full scope of the curse's design becoming clear. That's why you became a doctor. That's why you were drawn to practice in Vermilion County. You were meant to deliver their attempts at rebirth. Jonathan nodded miserably. I thought I was choosing my own path, following my own interests. But every decision I made led me here, to this practice, to this town, to you. I've spent 30 years of my life serving a curse I didn't even know existed. Eleanor stood and began pacing the small kitchen, her mind racing through the implications of Jonathan's revelation. The curse was not a simple matter of vengeful spirits seeking return through random Harper women. It was an elaborate design that had manipulated the lives of multiple families, positioning all the necessary players for the moment when the 42nd attempt would finally succeed. The 43rd child, she said suddenly. You know about it, don't you? You know what's different about this pregnancy. Jonathan's face went white. He reached for the whiskey bottle, but Eleanor had hidden it beyond his reach. I can feel it, he whispered. Every time I'm near you, I can sense something growing that doesn't belong to our world. The 43rd child is not like the others. It's not one of Thorne's murdered children trying to return. It's something else entirely. What kind of something else? Jonathan met her eyes, and in his gaze she saw the terror of a man who had looked too deeply into mysteries that were meant to remain hidden. I think it's Ezekiel Thorne himself, he said. I think the curse was designed not just to return his murdered children to life, but to provide him with a vessel for his own return. The 43rd child will be born alive because it will carry the soul of the man who orchestrated this entire nightmare. Eleanor felt the room spinning around her. The child growing in her womb was not just the key to releasing 42 trapped spirits. It was the reincarnation of their murderer's enemy, the religious leader who had sworn vengeance against her family line. How long do I have? She asked. Jonathan pulled out a medical chart, his trained eye calculating dates and development cycles. Based on the rate of growth I've observed, perhaps 2 weeks, maybe less. Eleanor moved toward the door, but Jonathan called after her. Mrs. Harper, where are you going? She paused at the threshold, her hand on the doorknob, her face set with grim determination. To end this, she said. One way or another, I'm going to end this curse before it destroys anyone else. Jonathan watched her disappear into the October night, then turned back to his ledger and his whiskey and his carefully documented evidence of the impossible. He had served his purpose in the curse's design, had played his role as witness and facilitator to 42 attempts at supernatural birth. But as he sat alone in his kitchen, surrounded by the accumulated weight of terrible knowledge, Dr. Jonathan Wren began to understand that his part in the story was not yet finished. The curse had one final task for the grandson of Deputy Marshal Theodore Wren. The next morning, the townspeople found him hanging from the oak tree in his backyard, his medical bag placed carefully at the base of the trunk, like an offering. Pinned to his coat was a note written in his careful physician's script. "The 43rd will be born on the new moon. God help us all when Ezekiel Thorne walks the earth again." Have you ever wondered what it would feel like to discover that your entire life had been orchestrated by forces beyond your understanding? That every choice you thought was your own was actually a step in a dance choreographed by the vengeful dead?